welcome to this session on what do event organisers need to know to address inequalities. My name is Fiona Pelham. I am CEO of Positive Impact Events, and today I'm really happy to be talking to you alongside Lucy Amos from Unicef UK. Today's session is a really vital session for us event professionals at the current time that we are facing. We're going to be exploring what the future of the event industry is in line with the world's inequalities and how we address those. Throughout today's sessions, there are definitely going to be terms and approaches that you hear that you're unfamiliar with. And we would really encourage you to fill in a question within the chat box, and we will have time to answer questions at the end of this session. So as I said, I am CEO of Positive Impact Events. We're a not-for-profit that is set up to provide education, engagement, and collaboration to create a sustainable event industry. Since March, our focus has very much been on how the future of human interaction happens, and human rights is essential for that. It's also very important to have the right expertise when we're talking about areas like this. So I'm very happy that Lucy is able to join us today. Lucy, can you tell us a little bit about your job role with Unicef UK?
Sure, thanks Fiona, and hello everyone. As Fiona said, my name is Lucy Amos. I work at Unicef UK, that's based out of London, and I am the Child Rights and Sports Specialist. And the nature of my job is really to try and build the capacity and increase good practice around human rights and child rights in the context, my role particularly, of sports events. And I've worked very closely with a number of event organisers, event owners, organising committees, and in particular the Commonwealth Games at some of their major events like the Bahamas Youth Games and the main Commonwealth Games in Gold Coast, Australia. And it's actually through that I met Fiona and have sort of started to do more outreach into the wider events industry. So great to be talking to you today.
Fantastic. Thank you, Lucy. So today, Lucy and I are going to be exploring how we as a global community of event professionals can be in action on human rights. Now, in event language, this could be explained as making sure that everybody is included in the event, everyone is participating in the event. And in today's webinar, we're going to learn what human rights are and how to engage our stakeholders to make sure that our events demonstrate best practice with consideration of human rights. And then finally, we're going to talk about guidelines that have been created with Unicef UK and Positive Impact Events, and that will be shared throughout the industry so that you can consider human and child rights when planning your event. Again, there is going to be time for questions, so please do write your questions in the question box. And we will also be directing you to where you can access guidelines at the end of this presentation, so you will have a good resource to take away. So to start with, I'll hand over to Lucy, who's going to take us on a journey through human rights. Lucy.
Thanks, Fiona. So yes, going to give you a little bit of an introduction on what are human rights and child rights, and really just child rights are a subset of wider human rights. But human rights are essentially the basic rights and freedoms to which all human beings are entitled simply by being human and from birth. They're the ground rules for treating other people fairly, with dignity and respect, and yeah, basically treating people equally. They're rooted in moral principles and all of the major world's religions, but they transcend all of these and are recognised by the international community in a number of international standards that took shape after World War II and the Nazi Holocaust in particular. And this really started off with the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948, but since then there is a whole body of international human rights law that's including the International Bill of Rights and a number of human rights treaties, including notably the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, which is the most ratified UN treaty, and it sets out the rights for children and also to some extent their carers. Now, working with event organisers and actually with the wider business community, there's often a lot of fear around human rights. Either business people don't quite understand how they can impact on human rights, or they think it's a very political area, and there's usually quite a lot of concern about entering into this discussion. In reality, human rights are central to the rule of law and social justice and those things that make for a stable business operating environment. And they're also, most UN human rights treaties are actually embedded in many national laws of different countries. So, for example, there's a standard I'll come to later, but that's embedded, for example, in the UK Modern Anti-Slavery Act and the French duty of vigilance laws. So it's in many ways human rights. It shouldn't actually be as unfamiliar to event organisers as some of you may fear. Others may be completely on top of it, and that's great. So if we talk about some of the human rights that you might be more readily interacting with on a daily basis, that would include providing decent working conditions and pay for all employees, having good occupational health and safety standards, recognising the privacy rights of both employees and your customers. And then a major issue, particularly this year in light of the Black Lives Matter movement, but also in recent years of the Me Too movement, the need for greater diversity and inclusion, whether that's of people from different genders and sexual orientations, for women and people of colour in all different parts of the world, and also people from different religions and so forth. Now, events themselves are not immune from human rights violations. With the best will in the world, things often go wrong, and it's common both in sports events but also wider events that they can be involved, often inadvertently, in using, for example, trafficked labour in the catering, cleaning and hospitality aspects of an event, and or, for example, sweatshop labour in the manufacture of goods and services and merchandise for the event. So that's a little bit of a background on what we mean by human rights and really why it's relevant to the event industry. Next slide, please. The good news is that there is an international roadmap to actually help event organisers and the wider business community through this. And that came into being in 2011, called the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights. And essentially, it's an international standard that specifies that states have a duty to protect the human rights of people within their jurisdiction from adverse impacts by any commercial activity, but also business enterprises, events, and frankly, any organisation that operates on a commercial basis has a responsibility to respect people's human rights, and that if things go wrong, both parties, that's governments and also events and the wider business community, need to play a role in providing access to effective remedy for victims. So for event organisers, the responsibility to respect human rights essentially boils down to doing no harm, or a duty of care to the people that you are going to interact with in any way, shape or form. The principles of the UN Guiding Principles are applicable to all companies and all events of all shapes and sizes and all geographies. Just the extent to which you respond will reflect the size and scale of your operation. And the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights include a lot of the same language. It's a risk management approach, but include a lot of the same processes that you will be familiar with. So there's a need to have a policy commitment. But there's also this more, perhaps less familiar concept of human rights due diligence. But within that, there are areas that you will almost certainly be much more familiar. So that's including identifying how your event can impact on people, assessing the nature of those risks and the potential severity of them, how you take action to both prevent and minimize the extent of the impact on people, how you track performance, and then report on how your organization and the event is doing to address or mitigate those risks to people. And then, as I mentioned earlier, there is a piece here about remedy. So if there is any harm caused, it's caused or contributed to by the event, it's what action you need to take to try and make good on that harm. So try and reverse the situation if that's still possible. Next slide, please. So how actually do you put that into practice? Well, one of the key components of the due diligence process is what in other contexts is called issue identification, or in the human rights language is more typically refers to how you identify and assess your potential or actual human rights impacts. And a key thing here is risks to people. So this is not looking at the risks or the issues that will actually may affect the event itself or its reputation, but how the event can impact, particularly in the first instance, negatively on people in and around the event. And the ways in which an event can impact on people fall into one of three categories. Either the event can cause a harm, so that might be, for example, if you were to discriminate against an employee, that would be your direct action. Alternatively, you might contribute to a harm, and that might be, for example, by setting unrealistic targets for the supply chain, and that has a knock-on effect. And finally, there's a piece here around direct linkage. So it's looking at actually how you might be involved in human rights harm through your commercial business relationships and or relationships with governments and others. And the key thing here is if you cause or contribute to a human rights harm, there are particular steps you need to follow, including addressing and mitigating those risks, but also trying to be involved in the process of remedy if things go wrong. Whereas if there's a direct linkage, it's more about trying to mitigate any harms and work with your business partners to exert leverage over them to try and affect change. Now, where this is a little bit different than some other typical risk management and other approaches is that when it comes to setting priorities, the key thing is not the proximity of the potential impact to the event. So it's not always that you prioritize those things that you cause and then work outwards. The key thing is actually what is called the saliency of the human rights risk, but in lay terms, that basically means the severity of them. And the way that you determine the severity of a human rights risk is the scope. So how many people are at risk of being harmed? Scale, the nature of the human rights issue at stake. So, for example, if we're talking about forced labour, which is very common in the construction sector, but also in the hospitality sector and human trafficking, then those are very, very severe human rights issues and would take precedence over some slightly more minor concerns. And then there is this concept of irremediability, which is a very big and probably overly complicated term, but it basically means have the impact got to a point where you can't, they're reaching a point where it's almost going to be impossible to reverse them. And you need to therefore act and set your priorities in accordance with their so-called salience or severity. And this is determined, as I say, through the scope, the scale, and the irremediability. But you need to make sure that there, for example, something that is almost getting to a point of going beyond the point of no return, a harm that could, for example, a very serious construction-related accident linked to an event. If the steps are not put in place to prevent those happening, then they can lead to absolutely irreversible damage like death or really serious injury. So that's some of the kind of thought processes that you will need to start to consider when setting priorities for events. Now, again, another key part of this due diligence process and really central to the whole ethos of trying to look at business and event operations through a human rights lens and with the due diligence process outlined in the UN Guiding Principles is the need for stakeholder engagement. So next slide, please. And when I talk about stakeholder engagement, yes, that includes talking with internal members of staff and other kind of key stakeholders, sponsors, or organizations that are helping with financing the event. But it also, and this is where it differs from many other management approaches to events, is it's actually talking about the need to engage and consult meaningfully and in an ongoing way with affected people. Essentially, you can't do effective human rights due diligence and have duty of care if you don't have good stakeholder engagement. These people are your eyes and your ears. So it's about actually talking with people that may be affected by the event, and that can include vulnerable and marginalized people in society. So that might, for example, include migrant workers. It might include people of color. It might include homeless people. It might include people from the LGBTQ community. And it also can very often include children. And for whatever reason, and it'll vary according to the different groups, it's important to understand that because these groups are either vulnerable or historically marginalized, they may be less trusting and maybe less willing to come forward in a stakeholder consultation or engagement process than you might standardly expect. They wouldn't necessarily put themselves forward unless there was some reassurance. So a key component here is, where necessary, getting expert advice. And for example, if you think that your event might actually impact on children, whether that's children in a community near the event or disrupt some of the schooling or any of those sorts of things, it's important actually not just to think about children as stakeholders that you could actually potentially cause harm to, but actually as participants in the process. And that means actually talking with them and getting their views. That will vary, obviously, according to the age of the children. And again, this is where organizations like Unicef can actually help you come forward and offer advice. And then when it comes to actually practically consulting with people, there's a really important need to share enough information with the affected groups in such a way that they can make informed decisions. There's very little point in holding information back that you may feel is sensitive, or you may feel perhaps puts the event in a bad light. But actually, if members of the community, the workforce, others in and around the event actually have insights that they can offer the event, actually holding back that information is counterproductive. So you need to be as transparent as you possibly can. And then another piece to bear in mind, obviously, because depending on where the event is taking place, there may be long-standing social grievances. And by entering into stakeholder engagement of this kind, it's possible, doesn't always happen, but you need to be aware of the fact that sometimes it may be the first time some of these marginalized or vulnerable groups have actually had a chance to air some of their concerns, or actually had anybody listen to their considerations when there are big events being planned around them. So it's important, therefore, to frame the dialogue around the limited impact of the event rather than wider society ills, so as to not unreasonably and unduly raise expectations. So there's some of the major considerations to take into account when looking at human rights due diligence. I haven't gone into all of the details, and there is further guidance that we'll elaborate on a little bit further into the presentation around this. But that hopefully gives you a starting point. Now, next slide, please. One thing that I also mentioned at the start is that the UN guiding principles are particularly important, and another unique characteristic of them, which is embedded within the whole human rights landscape, is the concept of remedy. And that is making good up on a harm, or if you like, restoring a condition that existed before the harm took place, if that's still possible. So, for example, if somebody was unfairly dismissed on discriminatory grounds, it might be that you would reinstate them. So remedy is really about, as I say, making good on a harm. where an event either causes or contributes to a harm, under the UN guiding principles, there is an obligation, expectation to provide for or cooperate in the remedy of those impacts. It's different if there's a direct linkage. So if a business partner is actually responsible for causing or contributing to the harm, then you may not have that direct connection, and therefore there is a lesser expectation with respect to remedy, although you could still use leverage to try and encourage that your partners to make remedy available. But if you cause or contribute to a harm, then there is a high expectation that you need to provide or cooperate in a channel for remedy. Now, that all sounds quite complicated, but actually remedy can range from anything from an apology to, as I say, maybe reinstatement if somebody has been unfairly dismissed, to restitution, and right up through to kind of civil or litigation proceedings. But it can be very basic, and therefore it's important to see that remedy isn't actually something to be afraid of. That complaints, as somebody has said in the area of sporting human rights quite recently, complaints can actually be seen as a gift, because they can put a spotlight on where your systems are falling down, where you need to make course corrections. Now, how you do this is often through grievance mechanisms, and these essentially are the processes and procedures that need to be put in place where an individual or group of individuals can bring a complaint, and how they can proceed through a complaint process to find some sort of settlement for that dispute or complaint that they have. And there are many different kinds of grievance mechanisms. There are obviously the governments and states have an obligation to provide the court system. That would be more on the extreme end. But there are non-judicial mechanisms. There are, for example, labour inspectorates, and there are ombudspersons for various issues. In many countries, there are what are called national human rights commissions, and they can actually bring mediation to some of these solutions. So when a harm happens, it's not that you necessarily need to solve the problem yourself. You can actually cooperate with others in trying to find a settlement for the affected individual or groups. And then one final thing just to mention here is that if you are in a position, and if your event, for example, is a bigger event, then you may need to put in place an operational level grievance mechanism. Now, for a smaller event, that might just be a hotline. But for a larger event, it might be something rather more sophisticated than that. So, for example, for the London 2012 Olympics, there was a complaints and dispute resolution mechanism for human rights issues in the supply chain process in their procurement. And if that is the case, there are certain criteria that these dispute resolution mechanisms or grievance mechanisms need to follow. They need to be seen as legitimate. So that means they need to be seen as credible or fair by the user. They need to be accessible. That means that there shouldn't be too many cost barriers to entry if possible, but also people should know about them. They should be predictable, and that means that the expected outcomes should be clear and transparent and communicated. They should be equitable. That doesn't mean that all of the parties in a complaint have the same level of resources they can bring, but they should be at least fair. They should be transparent. They should be based on human rights principles, and they should be a source of continuous learning. And I think that's one of the key considerations about this process of human rights due diligence and remedy. It's actually saying we don't live in a perfect world. Things go wrong, but if things do go wrong, consult with people, listen to what they have to say, and then put the corrective action in place to try and remedy those situations for those individuals actually immediately affected, but also revise the systems and processes that you have in place so it's circular. And as I say, those processes need to be based on engagement and dialogue with people. People, as I say, are your eyes and ears. If you get it right, they will be the absolute lifeblood of all events. But if you get it wrong, it's not what we're looking to do these days, and particularly with COVID, it's all about now putting people first. So thank you for listening to my little overview of this, and I'm happy to answer questions in due course. But over to you, Fiona.
Thank you, Lucy. That was an excellent overview, and you can really hear that you speak the language of human rights. So I'm now going to speak the language of event professionals a little bit and see how these two things come together. So what does the consideration of human rights mean for event organisers? That could seem a very large and overwhelming question for us to address. Fortunately, there are frameworks which exist, which are already in place and used by event professionals that will help us with this journey. And in fact, Lucy's slides there had headings such as stakeholder engagement and issue identification, and those headings tie into the first framework I'm going to talk to you about, which is ISO 2012-1. Most of you are probably aware, ISO 2012-1 is a management system standard. That means it is a way of working for implementing a process where you consider sustainability at every decision point you're making. It was inspired by the London 2012 Olympic and Paralympic Games, and it is in use now by the event sector all around the world. So ISO 2012-1, the framework itself, will enable you to consider human and child rights. As you go through ISO 2012-1, there are different stages. One of them is identifying your issues, another is engaging with your stakeholders, and it's at those points that you will be able to take action as Lucy outlined. Another framework which already exists and is used slightly less by event organisers, and this framework is definitely not tailored to the event sector, but it does consider human rights, and this framework is the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. So this framework is used by global businesses and global governments, and in fact, last week was the UN General Assembly Week, and the UN Sustainable Development Goal Action Campaign launched a decade of accountability. In other words, a decade where they're asking people to report back on their progress towards achieving the Sustainable Development Goals. So for us event professionals to be able to understand and take action on the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals in a way that also furthers human rights will really show the value of the role that we have in the world. Let's explore the Sustainable Development Goals a little further now and talk about ones which in particular are relevant to human and child rights. Goal number 10, reduced inequalities, and goal 16, peace, justice and strong institutions. And I'm going to talk a bit more later about how these goals and targets are actually an opportunity for a new narrative of the great work that we do as event organisers. There are two guidance documents that I want to talk to you about now, which will help you in your progress towards implementing human rights. The first of these guidance documents is what's called an acceleration action document. Now, last year, the United Nations called for anyone to submit ideas on progress that could be taken to advance the Sustainable Development Goals. Positive Impact Events submitted an acceleration action on what the event sector could do to advance the Sustainable Development Goals. Last week, we submitted our report and update of what has been done in the first year. And we also created a plan for what could happen in the future. Now, obviously, this year, our industry has been significantly impacted by COVID-19. And in fact, you could say that how our industry explains what we do is changing, and how we talk about ourselves, our narrative, also is changing. So we've moved away from just talking about meeting in a face-to-face environment and delivering education content, and we've moved towards Sustainable Development Goal 16, peace, and the target and indicator, which is about inclusive and participatory decision-making. So in other words, in our acceleration action that was given to the UN, we created a narrative for what event professionals do. And we said, what we do is enable inclusive and participatory decision-making. That is a target within the UN SDG action campaign. And that is a narrative that we can use that really shows the value of what happens when we bring people together, whether hybrid, virtual, or face-to-face. Now, enabling inclusive and participatory decision-making really aligns with the human rights goals, which Lucy outlined so clearly for us. In other words, it's a way that event professionals can tangibly and practically act on human rights. So no matter the ethnicity, the race, the gender, the religion, everyone's voices are heard, everyone's voices are included in decision-making. And this is definitely an opportunity for the event sector to create a narrative around what we do. The next guidelines that I want to tell you about are guidelines that have been co-created with Unicef UK. And these are guidelines to empower you to be able to consider human and child rights during the planning of your events. These guidelines are available as a free resource on the Positive Impact Events website. And over the next year or so, we will be working on developing these guidelines. So we would love to hear your feedback when you read them. These guidelines have been written in a way that they work with the frameworks I've just told you about. So they work with ISO 2012-1 and they work with the UN Sustainable Development Goals. The intention over the next few months is that major events will be testing these guidelines, and we really would encourage you to read these documents and be in communication with us on your ideas and your feedback. In addition to the guidelines being available on our website, there are also some additional tools that will help you. There is an animated video, there is an informative webinar, and some practical tips on considering human and child rights. So these resources have been created because we understand that event professionals can make a huge difference in the world around the consideration of human and child rights. We are the ones that bring people together and make sure that there is an inclusion of voices and everybody's voices are heard. We also know that events are the way that new ideas come to life, the way that people get experiences to learn different things. And in the world that we live in right now, where inclusion and participation is so valued, it makes sense that we event professionals will be saying we have the skills to make this happen. So at this point, I want to open for questions and hear what questions you have around planning your event with the consideration of human and child rights. As I mentioned before, you've been able to put your questions in the question box. And Kaylee, can you share with us some questions?
So there is no questions yet. So everyone, I do encourage you to put the questions in the question box. But I know, Fiona, you had a couple questions to ask Lucy.
Yeah, so if you let us know, Kelly, if any questions come in, and then Lucy, we can just ask a couple of questions. So event professionals may be overwhelmed just by the words consideration of human and child rights. Yet the reality is that they're already doing quite a lot in their day-to-day roles that covers the consideration of human and child rights. If you were talking to an overwhelmed event professional, Lucy, what would be the first thing that you would say?
I think I'd say don't panic. It's I think you know more than you think you do. I think inevitably there will be procedures and systems in place that you're versed in and your colleagues are highly familiar with. I think I talked about things like occupation health and safety, decent work conditions, privacy rights, you name it. There will be things that fall under the wider banner of human rights that you are highly familiar with. There may be other things that you don't know so much about, but then the next point would be ask for help. There are lots of organizations out there that have it within their remit, essentially, whether that is non-governmental organizations, UN bodies, think tanks, national human rights institutions, ombudspersons. There are lots of organizations out there, even pro bono legal firms that can help you. And I think even small events that think this is completely overwhelming, that you can go to a lot of those organizations and say, look, we know we should be doing something here, but how do we start? And they can help you. So don't panic.
I know with conversations around sustainability over the last 15 years, event organisers will often say, we can't do any more. It's up to our client. And I almost feel like with human rights, there is always more that can be done. But what would you say if someone says, I can only do what my client says? You know, if my client says, I want buy this type of merchandise, I have to buy it. Or if my client says, operate in this country or pay this much money, I have to do it. What would be your response to that?
I think that the bottom line is that actually, as an organization, you have responsibilities yourselves to avoid causing any harm. There are obviously times and instances where you don't have very much leverage, and yet you know that through your interactions with your client that there could be people could be adversely affected. So it's really a question of making sure you have your own robust systems in place, talking with experts where necessary, but actually using the leverage that you have got with your clients to the fullest extent possible. And where that is not possible, get creative. So maybe discuss things with peer-to-peer businesses. As I say, seek pro bono expert advice. There are ways around these things, but there are basic international standards, and in many jurisdictions, basic national standards that you simply have to comply with, and also aspire to as well. It's not simply about risk management and a very kind of negative thing. It's actually aspiring to make your event as forward-looking and people-centric as possible. So think of it as an opportunity.
Yeah, I think that is a great point, to think of it as an opportunity. And maybe it would be a nice idea to give a bit of an example. So we could talk about the Gold Coast Commonwealth Games as an example. Mm-hmm. So I saw a lot of stakeholder engagement that the Gold Coast Commonwealth Games did with a lot of local suppliers within the event industry. And one of the most impressive things I found was that the supply chain became very positive and proactive around sustainability. So one time we were at a local community meeting, and as always with major events, people will say, we don't think this should be on our doorstep. We don't want our tax money being spent on this. That's a very common piece of feedback. But what was very interesting at this event is that someone else in the community put their hand up and said, well, actually, I've learned quite a lot from this event happening. I've been involved in many of the supplier workshops. I've really appreciated it. And it was the first time I ever saw someone not belonging to the event. This person hadn't even got work from the event, but a stakeholder that was so engaged, they were able to put their hand up and support the event. So I thought that was very impressive. And I think that points to what you were saying there around there are opportunities here. Do you think, based on the current world we live in, there's going to be an increasing expectation for events to engage more and more stakeholders?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think if COVID's taught us anything, it's that, events can't happen without people. It's whether that's the workers, the employees, or all aspects of the event, the volunteers. but also it's the fans, it's the spectators, it's the participants, it's the performers or the athletes. All of the different people that are involved are absolutely core to these events. And if consideration is not given to them, then the event industry is going to be less and less sustainable and less trusted. But conversely, if you get it right, actually people will congregate and actually clamour to be working with you. And I think that's something that certainly some of the big sports events I've had interactions with have found, that actually it becomes almost a unique selling point by getting this stuff right.
And I'd love to hear an example of that, but I think Kaylee has a question, so we might come back to an example of that.
Yeah, so this wasn't so much a question from a member of the audience, but this person pointed out that there is a big culture of harassment in the event industry. So Lucy, harassment, I presume, is a type of human rights, and what can people do about that? So, I mean, obviously, if there is harassment in the workplace in relation to human rights, in relation to any aspect of the event, then yes, that's clearly a human rights issue. You don't want to be violating people's rights in any way, shape, or form, and that includes both everything from bullying right up through to physical or sexual harassment, or even physical abuse. And all of those definitely fall under the remit of human rights. There need to be robust systems in place that for the organisation. There need to be complaint channels, whistleblower facilities within the events, and where necessary, as I say, seek advice from experts. There are things like, as I say, national human rights commissions. In the UK, the Equality and Human Rights Commission may be able to offer advice, but also others. But it's an area that is central to almost any workplace, to make sure that people feel safe when they go to work. And if you're not getting that right, then it's not a great foundation. So it's one of many areas, and in terms of your risk assessments and impact assessment, that would need to be part of the discussion. Absolutely.
And I think the point you make there, Lucy, is really interesting, is that this is part of all business conversations. And as we've been delving more and more into human rights over the last few years, I've found myself wondering, why is the event industry sort of coming to this conversation later than businesses? Do you have any thoughts on that?
I've been working in the space of business and human rights for getting on for 20 years now, and I've seen a lot of different industries start to engage with the human and child rights discussion at different points over the years I've worked in this sphere. For example, in the early noughties, it was very often the extractive industry, so the oil, mining and the gas companies that were getting a lot of adverse publicity for displacing communities from their land. Or it would be, for example, in the apparel sector, there would be issues around sweatshop labour in, for example, the supply chain for sports footwear or clothing and all sorts. And then every sort of few years, another new industry would sort of start, either because there had been a scandal and they could no longer sort of hide their head under the level of the parapet, sort of thing. Whether it's a scandal, but sometimes it's an opportunity. Sometimes there will be chief executives who feel really passionate about this stuff, who recognise that actually they can be a force for good in society. So it's kind of why the event industry now. I think certainly the sports event industry, particularly with big events like the Olympics and the FIFA Men's World Cup. Those are big spotlight events, and they garner a huge amount of publicity. And they also provide an opportunity for campaign groups to shine a spotlight on issues that without the publicity and the media glare, that those issues might be overlooked. So I think sometimes it's because there's increased exposure around an industry that suddenly it becomes more relevant. But I think it can be an opportunity, and I think it's a chance to be proactive as well for some event organisers who maybe simply aren't in that league to be to have the same sort of level of publicity, but nonetheless recognise that they can be they can do good in society, and they can, for example, as you were saying, kind of help further the Sustainable Development Goals. So.
Yeah, and I can see we have another question, but I really see it's an opportunity for event professionals to create a new narrative around linking what we do to human rights, so that we're recognised more in the future, because we're facing challenging times right now. Mm-hmm. Kaylee.
Yeah. So this question is from someone who wants to know what they can do about human rights as someone who attends events. So this person has said they've noticed local stakeholders and suppliers employing Venezuelan migrants and refugees for events without fair pay and basic employee benefits. So what can they do as an observer of that?
So I think it would depend a little bit on the context, on the channels that may exist that have been organised by the events already. So if there are, for example, areas where an individual that spots a human rights abuse can safely register a concern, and that may not always be the case. It will vary from context to context. So individuals need to take care, but if they feel that there is a safe, anonymous, well-run procedure, then they should obviously bring a complaint directly to the event organizer. Where that's not the case, it may be that they could bring a complaint, as I said, to either a national human rights ombudsperson or a national human rights commission. That would be another channel where they might feel slightly more reassured about bringing areas of concern. And then there are plenty of other stakeholders. So there are trade unions, particularly some of the major international trade union confederations. They can actually play a really supportive role, and actually can also help signpost where to go for advice on how to raise concerns safely and with a chance of them having any positive lasting impact for good. You could engage with various human rights expert organizations, for example, like Amnesty International or Human Rights Watch, but also grassroots organizations within a country. And then there are various UN bodies, like the International Labour Organization would be one useful avenue, or other UN agencies. So there might be, for example, the Unicef office if there was something there of concern around children. So I hope that gives you a starting point. Good luck.
And I'll add one more, Lucy. Based on our conversations over the last couple of years, it's been really clear to me that event sponsors, big companies, are taking some very clear action on human rights. So it could be, if that event was sponsored by corporate brands, that corporate brand would have a whole human rights department within their business. And that could be another avenue to reach out to.
Very much so, yeah. I mean, some of the major sponsors, for example, as I say, this is an area that I've worked most closely with, but the big sports events, some of the major brands are actually really quite proactive in the space of business and human rights. Yeah. They've been working with the UN guiding principles themselves for many years, and actually can be sort of champions in this space. And they can sometimes also, I talked earlier about using leverage with your business partners, and it can be that the sponsors can actually start to use leverage with event owners and event organizers as well, to sort of try and both call out things when they go wrong, but actually be supportive as well in terms of trying to help them put robust systems in place so that human rights abuses don't reoccur. So yeah.
So this is an interesting question. We're at a point with the event industry where around the world, most face-to-face events are struggling to happen. The majority are not happening. And it's the case where people are starting to look at events and perhaps say, oh, we won't do that anymore. We won't attend events, or we won't host events. Mm-hmm. And there is that the gap that will happen without the events of inclusion and participation and engaging everyone in decision making. From your side, from the human rights side, which is very much outside of the event industry, how would you explain what happens at an event as a way that's valuable for people outside, so people outside the event industry can copy your narrative to say to their bosses and their CEOs, my job is vital because I do this, and this links to human rights?
Sorry, can you just rephrase the last part of the question again? So,
yeah, what could people say to their CEOs in a way that they were saying, my job is vital, okay, and furthers, advances human rights?
Okay, so I mean, I think for an event professional, particularly, I suppose now when times are really, really tough, and I completely get that. I think that's obviously there are so many industries right now that are really struggling. There's a real opportunity actually right now, I suppose, when people perhaps are still hoping that the events will come back into action with luck in the next few months. We hope as soon as vaccines and the like are made available. But there is maybe a chance to say, look, we've got a real window of opportunity here to actually make sure that we've got good systems in place. We can be talking to people so that actually we can create a whole new event industry that is stronger, but is also more sustainable, both from an environmental perspective, but also in terms of a really inclusive process that actually really works with communities. So I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, that's a really valuable point. And in your work with human rights, as you said, you've been doing this for many years, and the event sector is now coming more to the table to be mm-hmm. part of this conversation. What do you think could be the future for the event sector if they do take this time to rebuild in a way that considers human rights and advances the Sustainable Development Goals?
I mean, I think you were alluding to it yourself earlier, is that there's actually a really strong opportunity here to be seen as organizations that people actually want to partner with, that various different businesses are like, yeah, we really want to engage with the event sector, and we want to make offer our services or our goods and services, whatever it might be, in a way that is actually proactive and actually gets to the heart of how we can bring communities, workers all together and actually make events a real force for good in society, whether that's sports mm-hmm. events or cultural events or whatever it might be. So yeah.
And we've still got a little time left. So Lucy, do you want to ask me any questions from your human rights side, and I'll try and represent the event world?
I guess what would be the hardest thing that you think event professionals would find with this language, and also what would be the kind of the first hurdle you think they would need to overcome, and how we might be able to support that?
So the first hurdle, I would say, is people's time. And that's why now is quite an interesting time, because if you are in a role where you're really looking at how you work, you'll be able to add this into your envisioning of how you work. Mm-hmm. In all the sustainability conversations, time has always been the biggest barrier. And a few years ago, I was having a conversation with an event professional who said, we don't have time to think about how to do this differently. We just need the checklist that tells us what to do. And that's the biggest challenge, having the event industry empowered to really think through what they do and really own their decisions and be creative with their decisions and take the time to think, if my event is really to consider human rights, who are my stakeholders? Have I engaged them? Have I taken the time to make sure the vulnerable stakeholders feel that they can talk to me? And all too often an event has tight timelines, tight budgets, and people operate from the mentality of just give me the checklist of how it's been done before. And I really do think we're at a make or break moment now. We're either reinventing ourselves as the industry that makes the world a better place, to put it broadly like that. So we're the ones that bring people's voices together, enable inclusion, further the Sustainable Development Goals, or we're an industry that follows other people's leads and brings people together in one big room. And at the moment, the world doesn't want people together in one big room, whether we agree with that or not. So we're at a point where we could re-envisage ourselves. So if you can gift us time, Lucy, that would be great.
Yeah, no, I mean, and I think actually just responding to that, I mean, and it's something I'm very well aware of within from my insights with the sports events world, is that there's often, there's limited resource and there is huge time pressure to deliver the events as expected on whatever date it might be and however many months or years down the line. And I get that. I think it's where my point about asking for help really comes in. It's, you don't have to do all of this stuff yourselves, and also you don't have to always do it at the highest level. So some events are really quite small, and or even some of the big events, they maybe can't spare or allocate the resource to do this in a way that would be, if you like, optimal. But they can interact with experts. They can get help from experts. As I say, charities, UN bodies, national human rights organizations, you name it, are really there to help and hold people's hands, and actually can be very creative and work with the event industry to find even just like little chinks of good practice to try and address. And ideally that would follow the basic idea of human rights due diligence. But as I said, although there is a universal expectation for all events and all businesses to respect human rights, how you go about doing that will actually can rightly reflect the scale and the size and the resources that can be allocated. And so there are creative ways that this can be looked at, and there is more and more research out there looking at how small to medium-sized enterprises, which I imagine quite a lot of the event industry would include, can actually, do aspects of the human rights work, to at least move us all in the right direction. So. And
I think that's a brilliant plug for the guidance document. I'm going to ask Kaylee to put the final slide up again so that everybody can see the link where they find the guidance document, because all of what we've been talking about today, how to support event professionals, take action on human rights, action can be taken through this guidance document. So you can access it from the Positive Impact Events website, download it, read it, give your feedback. As we said before, there is a film and a few other tools that you can use as well. So the website is at the bottom of this page. Please do access it and read it, because if you want a starting point, this guidance document is it. So thank you very much for joining me today, Lucy. It's been a great conversation, and thank you to all of you who are listening, who are now going to take action to consider human and child rights in your events. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.